Shalom everyone, my name is Tom Thorne from Avdei El Elyon, Servants of the Most High God Ministries, and today is January 20, 2023. I know it's been a while since I last did a video, but in the meantime we have moved twice. We moved to a much more rural setting. I've had a lot of yard work to do, and I'm sorry, I know that's not really an excuse. But anyway, I know the next question that some people would tend to ask me at this point is, am I homesteading? Well, not totally, but you might say we're moving in that direction. There is some good news to this also, though. The good news is that Amy, my wife, and I are still alive and kicking. Servants of the Most High God Ministries is still alive and functioning, and God is still on His throne. Amen. Amen. Today I will be starting a 4-part series on 1 Samuel chapters 28 through 31. This series is titled, the overall series titled is An End and a Beginning. And this will be part 1, the introduction and the prologue. 1 Samuel 28 through 31 comprises a literary unit in Scripture that begins with the Philistines gathering their forces to fight against Israel in 1 Samuel 28 verse 1. And then after Saul's death and Israel's defeat, this literary unit ends with the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead gathering Saul's bones and burying them. That's in 1 Samuel 31 verses 8 through 13. The 4 chapters, 1 Samuel 28 through 31, contain a prologue, a central section with 4 distinct subunits, and an epilogue. As we go through this portion of God's Word, we will notice a theme to each of the subunits and an overall theme to the entire group. We'll proceed with this material as follows. The unit title, as I said, is An End and a Beginning. Today we'll be talking about 1 Samuel 28 verses 1 through 4 plus some prior review. This is the background and the prologue. Part 2 will be 1 Samuel 28 verses 5 through 25. The title of that will be Saul's Final Mistakes. The third part will be 1 Samuel chapters 29 through 30, David's deliverance and rescue. And the last section, part 4, will be 1 Samuel 31, the death of Saul and the epilogue. The primary point that I want to bring out in this series of classes is that it doesn't matter what position or what authority God has given to people. It doesn't matter. We all have a choice to follow God's teachings and to reap the benefits, or to turn and walk the other way. The overall purpose of these classes will be to encourage each of us to follow God, no matter what path He has chosen for us. Follow Him with all of our heart, our mind, and our will. So this is part 1. Now my purpose in this part, in our class today, we will see that Saul had fallen into the trap of evil jealousy, and that this was one of the reasons for his downfall. And the call for us today is to avoid this type of jealousy as much as possible, to avoid it like the plague. So first of all, let's start out with a little background to the book of 1 Samuel. According to Jewish tradition, Samuel was the author of the first 25 chapters of the book of 1 Samuel. After his death, we're told in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 29, that Gad and Nathan contributed to the rest of the book. We know that Samuel wrote a book. We're told that in 1 Samuel 10, 25. And it is possible that the first 25 chapters of this book was that book referred to, or at least a part of it. The events of 1 Samuel span approximately 90 years, from approximately 1100 BC to 1010 BC. We're pretty confident that the rulership of David over Judah started in 1011 or 1010 BC. With this, we can date the events of 1 Samuel, chapters 28 through 31, as very shortly before this. 1 Samuel records the history of Israel in the land of Canaan as they move from the rule of the judges to being a unified nation under kings. Samuel emerges as the last judge, and he anointed the first two kings, Saul and David. The text we'll be reviewing occurs during the last days of the reign of King Saul. So now let's take a look at some background material leading up to 1 Samuel chapter 28. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, we find that David had almost been killed by Saul. In what must have been a perplexed state of mind, David needed to determine if there could ever be a means of reconciliation between the two of them, a means of reconciliation between Saul and himself. The test would be Saul's response to David's absence from the new moon feast held on the first day of every month. Now this is from 1 Samuel chapter 20. If Saul became set about David's absence, David knew there was no hope of mending the differences. If, on the other hand, the king was cooperative, then there was still a chance. Saul's son Jonathan would approach his father on the matter of David not being present and relay the results to David with the predetermined method of shooting arrows. Jonathan and David agreed to meet at a certain spot after the feast. Jonathan would shoot 3 arrows, as if he were shooting at a target. If he told his assistant that his arrows were on the side of you, David would know that there was safety, or that Saul was still on his side, and no harm would come to him. If, on the other hand, he told his assistant, "Behold, the arrows are beyond you," David should leave, for this was an indication that Saul was angry. Saul's response was what David feared, and he knew there was no hope. The arrows were beyond Jonathan's lad. Saul's attitude was beyond reconciliation. As far as can be determined, David was a young man of no more than about 20 when he was forced to leave Saul's palace and his own home because of Saul's relentless determination to destroy him. Yet David, even though he was driven from Saul's presence, he didn't waste his time. As for approximately the next 10 years, while he was running from Saul, and he was at the same time spent his time fighting for the benefit of his beloved nation Israel. We need to pause here and realize that David was a young man when this happened. He was only about 20. As young as he was, his faith must have been incredible. During this period of time, God was teaching David many things. Lessons David still shares with all who read his Psalms, many of which find their settings in this turbulent period, such as Psalms 18 verse 34, Psalm chapter 52, 54, 56, and 57. All of these things were certainly working together to prepare David to be the kind of leader who would glorify God and inspire his people. Eventually, David and his followers fled to the wilderness of Ziph. Saul learned from the Ziphites about David's hiding place, so the king and 3,000 chosen men went to the hill of Hakilah in the desert of Ziph to search for David. Again, the Lord miraculously delivered his chosen one, who this time he came with Abishai, a skilled and faithful soldier and Joab's brother. He came so close to the sleeping king, he came so close to Saul, that David took both his spear and his water jug. Yet David dared not hurt the Lord's anointed. After crossing the ravine opposite Saul, David shouted to Abner, who supposedly guarded Saul, and tauntingly scolded him for his carelessness in allowing the king's spear and water jug to be taken. Saul then awoke and once more heard David's earnest request that he be left alone. God's protection of Saul's young rival became very evident to Saul. so much so that he could only confess his own wickedness. In 1 Samuel 26:21 he does so, and recognized fully and finally that David was destined to become the king of Israel. So far as it can be determined, Saul became resigned to his fate and never again tried to interfere with the will of God for the kingdom, and its next appointed leader. Although this did not appear to diminish his jealousy for David. If this was Saul's true feeling, it appears that David was not aware of it. So he reluctantly left Judah to find safety among the Philistines. This removed David from the feared danger of Saul and also brought favor from the Philistines, to the point that there was no more fear of him. David spent a year and 4 months among the Philistines just before Saul's death. We're told that in 1 Samuel 27, verse 7. After years of running and hiding, David finally led his immediate family, his wives Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, and his 600 followers, along with their families, to Gath, and cast himself and his clan at the mercy of Achish, a Philistine ruler, the king of Gath, in 1 Samuel 27, 1 through 3. From there, David and his 600 men carried out raids against various peoples, including the Geshurites, who were a tribe bordering Philistia on the south, the Girzites, a people living between Philistia and Egypt, and the Amalekites, who were nomads living in the area of South Canaan between Mount Seir and the Egyptian border. David reported to Achish that his attacks were made in the Negev of Judah, the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, or the Negev of the Kenites, which persuaded Achish that David was a loyal subject. Now this would have occurred in approximately 1013 to 1011 BC, about a year before David began to rule over Judah. Now I say a year before he began to rule over Judah, we need to remember that David did not become a king over all Israel for 7 more years. Okay, so let's have a little summary of the background here. Although David had been loyal to Saul since he was a teenager and led many victorious campaigns for Israel, Saul had become extremely jealous of the young man and attempted to take his life more than once. David eventually felt it was necessary to flee from the king. For about 10 years, he was running and hiding and learning lessons from God. Eventually, he fled to Gath, part of the land of the Philistines, of which Achish was the ruler, and he spent 16 months in Gath of Philistia before Saul's death. So this brings us to the point of our study in 1 Samuel 28 through 31. So 1 Samuel 28 verses 1 through 4 is the prologue to this story, this literary unit. Verse 1. In those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." David said to Achish, "Very well. You shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well. I will make you my bodyguard for life." Verse 3. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. Verse 4. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. So let's go back to verse 1. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." To go out with me, Achish, in the army. After David had been with the Philistines and the king of Gath for 16 months, fleeing for his life, King Achish and the Philistines prepared for war against Israel. Excuse me. The statement, he assembled his armies, the king assembled his armies, plural, could indicate that there was more than one army that he had put together for this war, and their enemy was Israel. This would have been all 12 tribes that were somewhat united underneath Saul, although the battle would not have taken place over the entire nation, over the entire country. King Achish, knowing of the skills in battle possessed by David and his mighty men, still may have had mixed level of confidence in David, as David was still an Israelite by birth. Achish, with a feeling of trepidation and uncertainty, said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me, in the army." By the word "understand" is written in Hebrew. This could easily be translated as, you need to completely understand. You need to completely understand this. Achish here is making certain that David will be on his side in the fight against Israel. He needs to be sure of this. He may have felt that if David were to fight for Israel, the whole battle may not be worthy of engaging in. It's as if Achish was saying to David, you need to be sure you know what's happening, and you need to give me your honest pledge and full assurance that you are not going to turn against me. Another thought here is that Achish does mention the Lord, Yahweh, and Elohim at times in speaking with David. He therefore at least knew of Yahweh, the Lord. It is even possible that he felt that because he was being assured that David was on his side, he felt he was being assured that David was on his side, therefore the Lord Yahweh was on his side as well. It's possible that this led to Achish's war with Israel. This could have been the turning point in his decision. It appeared as if the Philistines were nearly in continual war with Israel. A little history on the Philistines may help us understand this situation a little better. The political structure of the Philistine society was quite unique. There was no single unified Philistine nation, state, or kingdom. The Philistine people were somewhat a unified confederacy of the 5 leading cities: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath. These 5 cities were referred to as the Pentapolis and are first noted in Joshua 13, verse 3. Each of the 5 cities was ruled by a separate chief or king. The individual chiefs set the agenda in their cities, but when it came to war, these 5 united. By the middle of the 11th century BC, the Philistines had become powerful enough that they began to expand their influence from the coast to the east and to the north. And they started to encroach upon Israelite territory. There were 2 primary sources of conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites. The first was the quest for land and dominance, that old theory of greed. The second was the worship of other deities. The primary Philistine god was Dagon. According to ancient mythology, Dagon was the father of Baal. He was the fish god. Dagon represented as half man and half fish creature. This image furthered an evolutionary belief that both men and fish evolved from the primal waters. Dagon may have also been thought of as the provider of grain. So Dagon was similar to many other idols in that he personified natural forces that had supposedly produced all things. Now I want to show a map here showing the 5 cities of the Pentapolis. We show here on the map here, on the west side, the Mediterranean Sea, and the 5 cities from north to south: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza along the sea, And a little bit inland, we have Ekron and Gath. This is the territory of the Philistines. Now, this map is not perfectly to scale, but it does give a good idea of a general idea of where the Philistines were in comparison to Jerusalem and the Dead Sea on the east side. So now let's move on to verse 2. David said to Achish, "Very well, you shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Through carefully chosen words, David tells Achish that he will become well aware of the capabilities of him and his mighty men if he is not already. Although he does not specifically tell Achish that he would fight on his side. It appears as if Achish takes this as a confirmation that David will fight along with him, to which he responds that after the victory is over, he would make David his bodyguard for life. Interestingly enough, the Hebrew for bodyguard is shomer l'roshi, shomer l'roshi, which is literally translated as keeper for my head. David had already kept one Gathite's head in 1 Samuel 17:14, but he did so only after he removed it from Goliath's body. Honestly, the offer to become Achish's bodyguard for life, I don't think David was really thrilled about that. I don't think David was really thrilled about that offer. But what exactly did David mean by these words? Did Achish believe that what David did for Israel's enemies, he would do also for him? Achish probably heard something differently than what was actually said. But this miscommunication worked in David's favor, and perhaps is what he was hoping for. The Bible Knowledge Commentary provides a good summary of events so far. A day came when the Philistines resolved to make another massive assault against Israel. Whether they were encouraged to do so because of the obvious instability of the now aged King Saul and his nation, or because of David's apparent shift of allegiance, or for some other reason, is not clear. But they felt that the time was then propitious. The result, of course, was that David found himself in a most compromising situation. For he would now be called on to demonstrate his loyalty to his new Lord by fighting against his own people. What a situation David finds himself in. What a situation. So moving on to verse 3. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. In verse 3, we have two parenthetical statements. Number 1, now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And the second, and Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. Interestingly, not much is said about Samuel's death. No detail is given on the circumstances or exactly where it happened, just that they buried him in Ramah. Although the mentioning of his death sets the stage for his reappearance later in the chapter. And secondly, Saul put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. These were individuals who claimed the ability to contact the dead, either serving as intermediaries through whom the dead would speak, or as rousing the dead to speak for themselves. This establishes Saul's clear understanding that it was forbidden for Israelites to consult these individuals. One would think that Saul may have been acting on the advice of Samuel in doing so, and this would tend to make a person believe that possibly Saul was on a rebound toward righteousness. This curious act makes his experience later in the chapter even more ironic. Verse 4. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. Excuse me. In verse 4, we revert back to the story. Saul found himself in a desperate situation. Samuel, his true counselor, had died, and the Philistines were camped at Shunem in the valley of Jezreel, some 75 miles from Gath. Because of revenue possibilities, the Philistines wanted to control this prime piece of real estate, which was a major trade route connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia. Saul set up camp at Gilboa, likely a mountain just south of Shunem that overlooked the valley of Jezreel. From that vantage point, Saul could view Philistine troop movements in relative safety, although Saul was not set to cope with what he saw when he saw the size of the Philistine army. So the stage was set for war between the Philistines and Israel. But before the war occurred, three things of particular note are discussed in the rest of the chapter: fear, the woman at Endor, and the appearance of Samuel. And these three items will be the subject of part 2 in our series. Now, the following map shows where the nations were staged at before the war. We see Achish and the Philistines. Well, we see here on the top a bigger level map, and the bottom an insert map. Let's just take a look toward the bottom, focus toward the bottom on the insert map. Achish and the Philistines were camped at Shunem. Shunem, if you look at this insert map, about 2/3 towards the top, right towards the middle is Shunem. Saul and the Israelites were camped at Gilboa, which is about probably 7 miles or so south of Shunem. And Endor, the place where Saul met, the medium at Endor, is north of Shunem, northeast of Shunem. Now we need to talk a little bit about Saul and jealousy now at this point. Before we conclude our introductory session to this unit, we need to take a quick review of some of the problems that Saul had. First, Saul did not respect God's transcendent, supreme holiness, His holiness that surpassed all others. He usurped the role of the priests in 1 Samuel 13, verses 8 through 14. Second, Saul did not respect God's moral holiness. He disobeyed God's clear commands with regard to Amalek, noted in 1 Samuel 15. Third, he had an intense amount of evil jealousy for David. Now, I need to define the word jealous in this case. Jealous in this case is being envious or resentful for the good fortune or achievement of another. Saul was resentful of David. He spent countless hours in pursuit of his companion with the intent of killing him. Why? David had only done good for Saul and the nation, yet Saul's jealousy burned. Saul wasted a huge amount of energy and resources in this pursuit. This time and resources and money could have been devoted to the benefit of the country. Not strictly because of this jealousy, but partially, Saul experienced an early death in war. If David were on his side, things may have been different. Fourth, Saul went to the grave with a huge loss of respect and dignity. After his son Ishbosheth, who ruled over part of the country briefly, Saul's descendants are out of the picture completely. The lasting dynasty that he could have experienced was gone. And number 4, the last straw was Saul's appealing to the woman at Endor. As we recently learned in a previous class, jealousy is not always a sin, but many times it is. Jealousy is not a sin when you are vigilant in guarding or maintaining something that belongs to you, which is another definition of jealousy. God is a jealous God. He is vigilant in guarding His laws and His people. But when you are envious, mad, even to the point of wanting to kill someone for their good accomplishments, that is wrong. That is evil jealousy. I want us to think about this kind of jealousy. In the first place, was there any reason for Saul to be jealous of David, over David? I don't think there was. After all, David had just done good for Saul. He calmed his nerves when he was upset. He defeated the giant when no one else would even try. He led Israel to many victories in battle. Saul was envious at David, plus concerned that David was going to rob him of his dynasty. David didn't rob him of it. He lost it himself. He could have used David for good for the rest of his reign and died a respectful king had he repented of past sins. But he chose not to. I want us to think of jealousy in our lives, in our personal lives. When we are jealous of someone, is the issue just our imagination? Does being envious or mad of others' accomplishments help anything? When we are in such a state of mind, do we, as Saul did, waste a lot of time and effort and resources trying to get back at such a person and make him or her look bad? Do we spread rumors that are often half-truths at best? Are we angry at the world? And do we sometimes take it on our family or our coworkers on the job? Do we grumble and complain and gossip and speak unfairly about the people we have an issue with? Are we just not easy to get along with? Are we just a person who people don't want to be around? What good does any of this do? Does it build or destroy our integrity? Does it cause the majority of people to like, appreciate, and respect us more or less? Does it make us happier people who are easier to work with and get along with, or not? Does it help us to act out the gospel of Yeshua with our lives, or does it turn people off? I think the answers to these questions are obvious. And with that, I think that we all should be especially careful about not harboring evil jealousy. Jealousy can ruin friendships. It can ruin people's character. And it can turn people against Jesus, Yeshua. In my opinion, it was the jealousy Saul harbored against David that absolutely tore him up. Sure, he had sinned before this, but he could have repented. But once he got to the state where his goal was the death of David, I wonder if he was beyond the point of repentance. There are many lessons to be learned from the story of Saul and David. One of them is for people of all times, and possibly today more than ever, with all the prosperity this country has, is for us as believers in Yeshua to resist being jealous with evil jealousy toward other people, regardless of the circumstance. Two of the more common occurrences of jealousy that we often see, and I hate to say this, this is true, two of the more common occurrences of jealousy that we often see at our place of business and at our place of worship. There are probably few large company promotions that happen without someone feeling hurt and jealous over the other person. Unfortunately, this often happens in our churches as well. The elevation of a person to deacon, deaconess, lay pastor, or other positions often causes jealousy. We need to stay away from getting jealous in such situations, or any situation. We need to pray that God not let Satan get a hold of us and drive us into a state of evil jealousy. This is just what Satan wants. He knows what can happen. He knows that without being dealt with, it will get worse and worse. It may ruin an old friendship, cause a demotion, a loss of job, strife within families, or it may even cause the person to leave a church needlessly. And it will cause many unsettling and grief-filled hours. It will cause us to do the exact opposite of what we are admonished in Psalm 19:14, where we're told to let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in your sight, O Yahweh, O Lord, our rock and my Redeemer. Now, I'm not a psychologist or a counselor, but there are a couple of things that I have done to combat jealousy that I would like to suggest. First, go to the person face to face and compliment them on something. Just compliment them on something. Second, invite him and her over to your house for a dinner, or to a restaurant, or to a coffee, something like that. Talk to the person. Find out about his or her life. Chances are you have some things in common, that you may be battling with many of the same things that he or she is. And maybe you can help each other. Maybe your words can help each other. Offer to help this person. If you're not able to do any of these things because of geography, physically sit down with pen and paper and write him or her a letter. In my opinion, a physical letter is best. An email or phone call may be second best. And I do think that a text message is a far, far, far distant third. And the fifth thing we can do, the fifth goal here, is to break the ice, try to become friends, somewhat of friends with a person at least, and not be jealous. When I was a boy, back in the 60s, 70s, every Sunday afternoon, a local television station had a time slot where they played a family classics movie. This was a full-length movie, usually 2 hours, that generally had some moral values and was designed for family viewing. They had a series of about 50 to 80 movies that they would play over and over. So every year and a half or so, the same movie would play again. The advertisement for one of these movies, and I must have saw this advertisement many, many times, had Winston Churchill declaring, "I don't care how you do it, you must sink the Bismarck." The Bismarck was one of Nazi Germany's most powerful warships of World War II. The eventual sinking of the Bismarck represented one of the greatest team efforts in British history. In the same manner, the story of Saul is telling us, we must eliminate evil jealousy. End of story, case closed. We need to team with the God of heaven to accomplish this. On our own, we can't do it. In our message today, we reviewed the background to the literary unit of 1 Samuel chapters 28 through 31. We also studied the prologue to this unit, which was chapter 28, verses 1 through 4. We saw how the Philistines prepared for war. We discussed the state of the Philistine political structure, and we discussed the results of evil jealousy, with the appeal to all of us to eliminate it from our lives. In our next class, we will continue our studies covering 1 Samuel 28, verses 5 through 25. And the subjects will be fear, the woman at Endor, and the appearance of Samuel. Shalom, everyone. And in closing, I'd like to read Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26, the Aaronic blessing. Yahweh bless you, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Yivarecha Yahweh v'yishmerecha. Ya'er Yahweh panav elecha v'huneka. Yasa Yahweh panav elecha v'yasem leka shalom. Amen and amen.